When my mother's boyfriend knocked on my bedroom door, I never imagined the chain of events that would follow. What happens when the person you're supposed to trust crosses an unforgivable line? This moment didn't just shake my world, it shattered it. How do you find the courage to speak up when no one wants to hear the truth? Stay tuned as I unravel the most haunting experience of my life, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Where are you watching from today? When my mother's boyfriend knocked on my bedroom door that evening, I didn't answer at first. The sound startled me because I thought I'd been invisible in my sadness. My pillow was damp with tears, and the air in the room felt heavy, pressing against my chest like the weight of everything I couldn't say aloud. "Hey." His voice came through softly, almost like a whisper. "You okay in there?" Finally. She opened her eyes and finally looked up. I froze. His concern sounded genuine, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of relief. Someone had noticed. But then I remembered who he was, a man who wasn't part of my life a year ago. Yet now, he seemed to be everywhere. My mother had introduced Rick as someone who would change our lives for the better, but to me, he was just another stranger invading my already fragile world. I didn't respond, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, the door creaked open slightly, and his face peeked through the gap. "I know you're upset," he said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "Your mom told me you two had a fight." My mother and I fought often these days. Her frustration with me seemed endless, whether it was my grade slipping, my attitude, or the way I spent too much time alone in my room. She didn't seem to understand that I wasn't trying to push her away. I just felt lost. And now here was Rick, in my space, pretending he could fix something he barely understood. "I'm fine," I muttered, turning my face away to hide the tears. "You don't look fine," he said gently, sitting on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, and I tensed. "Listen, I'm not here to lecture you. I just want to make sure you're okay. Sometimes it helps to talk about it." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to tell him to leave, but another part, the part that was starved for attention, for someone to care, found his presence oddly comforting. He wasn't yelling or criticizing me like my mom always seemed to do. Instead, he looked at me with soft eyes, his expression calm and patient. "It's nothing," I said, my voice shaky. "Just stupid stuff." "Doesn't sound stupid to me if it's got you this upset," he replied, leaning in slightly. "Come on, kiddo. I'm a pretty good listener. You can tell me anything." The word kiddo made me flinch. It felt condescending, yet at the same time it disarmed me. He wasn't speaking like an authority figure. His tone was casual, almost friendly. Against my better judgment, I found myself opening up, the words spilling out before I could stop them. She doesn't get it. I try so hard, but it's like nothing I do is ever good enough for her. She's always mad at me, and I don't even know why half the time." Rick nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, moms can be tough. They've got this idea of how everything should be, and when it doesn't match up, they take it out on us. It's not fair, but it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong." Hearing someone say that, acknowledging my feelings without dismissing them, was like a balm on an open wound. I wiped at my eyes, embarrassed by my tears, but too drained to care. "Thanks," I murmured, staring down at my hands. "I guess I just needed to hear that." Rick shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. Hey, anytime. You're a good kid, you know that? You've got this spark. You just need someone to remind you of it. The compliment caught me off guard. It wasn't like the hollow praise my teachers threw around, or the perfunctory, good job I sometimes got from my mom. Rick's words felt intentional, like he'd seen something in me that others hadn't. For a moment, I forgot to be wary of him. You're just saying that, I said, a small nervous laugh escaping me. No, I mean it, he insisted, his voice dropping slightly. You're special, even if you don't see it right now. There was something in his tone that made my stomach twist. Not unpleasantly, but not comfortably either. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in the room felt different. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine on the bedspread. When he finally rested it there, his touch was light, almost tentative, as if testing the waters. Rick, I began, my voice trailing off. I didn't know what I wanted to say. Maybe to ask him to move back, to give me space, or maybe to thank him for being kind when I felt so alone. Stay back and stay safe. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his gaze intense and unreadable. You deserve to feel appreciated, he said softly, his fingers brushing against mine. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not enough. I should have pulled my hand away. Every instinct screamed at me to create distance, to set a boundary, but I didn't. Maybe it was the vulnerability of the moment, or maybe it was the way he made me feel seen when no one else did. Whatever the reason, I stayed frozen, the line between comfort and something else, blurring in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Rick, Before I could find my voice again, the sound of my mother's voice calling from downstairs shattered the moment. Rick pulled back quickly, his expression shifting to something unreadable. I should go, he said, standing abruptly. But if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. He left without waiting for a response, leaving me alone with the confusion and unease swirling in my chest. The room felt colder in his absence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I couldn't take back. I sat there for a long time after Rick left, staring at the door as if expecting him to come back. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, relief that he was gone, guilt for not asking him to leave sooner, and something else, a strange, inexplicable longing for the attention he had given me. I hated myself for even feeling it, but I couldn't deny it was there. Dinner was quiet that night. My mother talked about her day, recounting stories from work with her usual sharp tone. Rick chimed in occasionally, his casual charm masking any trace of the tension that had filled my room just hours earlier. I kept my head down, pushing food around my plate and trying to avoid his gaze. You've barely touched your food, my mom said, eyeing me. What's wrong now? Nothing, I mumbled, stabbing at a piece of broccoli. I wasn't about to tell her the truth, not about our fight earlier, and definitely not about Rick. Come on, give her a break, Rick said, his voice light and teasing. She's probably just tired, aren't you, kiddo? The way he said kiddo sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. My mom rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath before taking a sip of her wine. Rick's phone buzzed on the table, and he picked it up, glancing at the screen. I've got to take this, he said, standing and heading into the other room. The moment he was gone, My mom turned her attention back to me. "You need to stop sulking," she said sharply. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this attitude has to stop." "I'm not sulking," I shot back, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm just tired, like he said." "Well, maybe if you didn't spend all your time moping around, you wouldn't be so tired," she snapped. Her words stung, as they always did, but I bit my tongue, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry again. Rick returned a few minutes later, his easy smile back in place. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, looking between us. My mom waved him off, already distracted by her phone, and he gave me a small, knowing look before sitting back down. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I went to bed early, locking my door behind me and burying myself under the covers. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the way Rick had looked at me, the way his hand had lingered on mine. I hated how much it unsettled me, how much it lingered in my thoughts despite my efforts to push it away. The next few days were uneventful, or at least as uneventful as they could be in our house. My mom was busy with work, leaving early and coming home late, and Rick seemed to make himself scarce during the day. I avoided him as much as possible, but every now and then I'd catch him watching me with that same unreadable expression. One afternoon, I was sitting on the couch with my laptop trying to finish an assignment for school. The house was quiet. My mom had gone to a meeting, and Rick was supposed to be out running errands. Or so I thought. He said, "Hey." His voice startled me, and I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Didn't mean to scare you." His voice brushed against my skin. "It's fine," I said quickly, closing my laptop. My heart raced, but I couldn't tell if it was from surprise or something else. "Working hard?" he asked, stepping into the room and sitting on the arm of the couch. He was close, too close, but I didn't move. "Or just school stuff," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Nothing exciting." He smiled, that same disarming smile that had caught me off guard before. "You're a smart kid. Bet you're acing everything." "Not really," I admitted, glancing down at my hands. "It's been hard to focus lately." "Yeah?" He leaned in slightly, his tone softening. "Anything I can help with?" he asked gently. "No, I'm fine," I said quickly, shifting away from him. The space between us felt suffocating, and I stood up, clutching my laptop like a shield. "I should probably get back to work." Rick's smile faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly, standing as well. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." I hurried upstairs, my hands trembling as I closed the door to my room. The encounter had been brief, but it left me shaken. There was something about the way he acted, the way he spoke to me, that felt wrong. But at the same time, part of me craved the attention, the validation he offered. It was a twisted, confusing mix of emotions that I couldn't untangle, no matter how hard I tried. A week later, my mom announced she'd be out of town for the weekend. "Rick will be here," she said casually over dinner. "So if you need anything, just ask him." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "You're leaving?" "It's just a work thing," she said, not even looking up from her plate. "I'll be back Sunday night." Rick didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me. I forced myself to nod, pretending it didn't bother me. But inside, I was panicking. The idea of being alone with him for an entire weekend filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. If you didn't send Try back soon, it would be too late. That Friday night, I stayed in my room, headphones on and music turned up loud to drown out my thoughts. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wouldn't be able to take back. Saturday morning was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed in my room as long as I could, pretending to be asleep even though I'd been awake for hours. The air in the house felt heavy, and every creak of the floorboards made my stomach twist in anticipation. Eventually, hunger forced me downstairs. I tiptoed into the kitchen, hoping Rick wouldn't notice. The last thing I wanted was another encounter. But as I rummaged through the fridge, his voice startled me. "Good morning, kiddo." I jumped, nearly dropping the carton of milk. Turning, I saw him leaning against the doorway, his hair slightly mussed like he'd just woken up. He was dressed casually in sweatpants and a t-shirt, and the sight of him like that, relaxed, comfortable, made me feel even more uneasy. "Morning," I mumbled, turning back to the counter to pour my cereal. "You sleep okay?" he asked, his tone light, conversational. "Yeah," I lied, avoiding his gaze. My hands shook slightly as I put the milk away, but I willed myself to stay calm. He was just being polite, I told myself. There was no reason to feel so on edge. Rick walked over to the coffee maker, humming softly as he poured himself a cup. "So, any big plans for today?" "Not really," I said, keeping my answers short. I hoped he'd take the hint and leave me alone, but instead, he grabbed his coffee and sat down at the table, watching me. "You've been awfully quiet lately," he said after a moment. "Everything okay?" I shrugged, focusing on my bowl of cereal. "Yeah, just busy with school." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me, making my skin crawl. "You know, you don't have to hide up in your room all the time. I don't bite." I forced a laugh, hoping it would end the conversation, but Rick didn't seem satisfied. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I mean it," he said, his voice softening. "If there's something bothering you, you can tell me. I'm here for you." The sincerity in his tone made my stomach twist. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe he meant well, but another part, the part that remembered the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way his gaze sometimes lingered a little too long, told me to keep my guard up. "I'm fine," I said, standing up and grabbing my bowl. "I should get started on my homework." Rick nodded slowly, his eyes following me as I moved to the sink. "All right, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." I didn't look back as I headed upstairs, my heart pounding. Something about the way he said it, like he was offering more than just a listening ear, left me feeling uneasy. I locked my door behind me and tried to focus on my schoolwork, but the unease lingered. That evening, I heard a knock at my door. My chest tightened as Rick's voice came through. "Hey, you want to watch a movie or something? I've got popcorn." I hesitated, staring at the door. Part of me wanted to say no, to stay in the safety of my room. But another part, the part that hated the loneliness, that craved some kind of connection, hesitated. "Come on," he coaxed. "It'll be fun. Just you and me. No pressure." The sound of his voice, so calm and inviting, chipped away at my resistance. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Rick stood there with a bowl of popcorn in one hand and a DVD case in the other, his smile warm and disarming. "Great choice," he said, holding up the movie. "One of my favorites." I followed him downstairs, my stomach churning with a mix of nerves and anticipation. We settled on the couch, the popcorn between us. At first, everything felt normal. We laughed at the movie's jokes, and For a brief moment, I let myself relax. But as the evening went on, the atmosphere began to shift. Rick leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the couch. It was a casual gesture, but when his hand brushed my shoulder, I stiffened. He didn't move it, and the longer it stayed there, the harder it was to focus on anything else. "You're tense," he said, his voice low. "You should try to relax." "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. Rick's hand moved to my shoulder, his fingers lightly brushing my skin. "Hey," he said softly, "you don't have to be so nervous. It's just me." I felt frozen, my body rigid as his hand lingered. The movie played on, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. All I could think about was how close he was, how his presence seemed to fill the room. "You know," he said after a moment, his tone almost conspiratorial, "I think you're really special." His words sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Rick shifted closer, his hand sliding down to my arm. "Oof. You deserve to feel appreciated," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not enough." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Rick, The sound of a text notification broke the moment. Rick pulled back, checking his phone with a faint frown. "Sorry about that," he said, standing up. "I should take this." I nodded quickly, unable to meet his gaze as he walked out of the room. The moment he was gone, I bolted upstairs, locking my door behind me and collapsing onto my bed. My hands were trembling, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. And I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in this house alone with him any longer. Sunday morning came far too slowly. I spent the night tossing and turning, unable to shake the events of the evening before. Rick's words, his touch, the way he had looked at me, it all replayed in my mind like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. My stomach churned as I realized there was still a whole day ahead of me. Alone in the house with him, I needed a plan, some way to avoid him until my mom came home that evening. I stayed in my room as long as I could, pretending to sleep when I heard him walking past my door. Eventually, my hunger got the better of me, and I forced myself to venture downstairs. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made my every step feel deafening. I hoped Rick had gone out or was still asleep, but as I turned into the kitchen, I found him sitting at the table, sipping coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice unnervingly casual. "Morning," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze as I went to the fridge. "You're up late," he commented, watching me as I poured myself a glass of juice. "Figured you'd be an early riser." "I didn't sleep well," I admitted, hoping he'd drop the conversation. Rick frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Still upset about something?" "No, I'm fine," I said quickly, grabbing an apple and heading for the stairs. "I just need to get some studying done." "Wait," he said, stopping me in my tracks. "You don't have to run off. Come sit for a minute." For a minute. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to turn back, trying to keep my expression neutral. "I really have a lot to do." Rick smiled, gesturing to the seat across from him. "It'll just take a second. Come on, humor me." Reluctantly, I sat down, keeping the table between us like a barrier. Rick set his coffee cup down and folded his hands, studying me with an intensity that made me squirm. "You know," he began, his tone soft, "I've been thinking about you." The words sent a jolt through me, and I forced a nervous laugh. "Thinking about me?" "Yeah," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You're such a smart, kind girl, but I can tell you don't hear that enough. I don't think anyone really sees how special you are." I didn't know how to respond. My throat felt dry and my heart was racing. Part of me wanted to thank him for the compliment, but another part wanted to scream at him to stop. The way he was looking at me, it wasn't right. It wasn't. I should go, I stammered, starting to stand. Rick reached out, his hand brushing mine. "Wait," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I'm just trying to help. You deserve to feel appreciated, you know? You don't have to keep everything bottled up." "Ian." I yanked my hand back, the movement sharp and abrupt. Rick's expression shifted, his smile faltering for the first time. "Did I do something to upset you?" he asked, his tone suddenly cautious. "No," I said quickly, my voice shaking. I really need to get back to work." Without waiting for a response, I hurried upstairs, slamming my door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The hours crawled by as I stayed holed up in my room, refusing to come out for anything. I barely ate, my appetite replaced by a growing sense of dread. Every time I heard Rick's footsteps outside my door, my heart leapt into my throat. Around midday, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom, on track to be home around 8. "Everything okay?" I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the screen. Should I tell her? Would she even believe me? The thought of confronting her with this, of seeing the look on her face, made my stomach turn. I settled for a simple reply. "Everything's fine." It wasn't fine, though. The walls of my room felt like they were closing in on me, and I knew I couldn't stay cooped up forever. I needed to get out, to clear my head and put some distance between myself and Rick. Grabbing my jacket, I cracked open my door and listened. The house was quiet. Maybe Rick was in his room or out running errands. Either way, I wasn't going to waste my chance. I crept downstairs, careful to avoid making any noise, and slipped out the front door. The crisp air hit me like a wave, and I inhaled deeply, letting it fill my lungs. For the first time all weekend, I felt like I could breathe. I started walking, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from the house. I ended up at the park, sitting on an empty bench and watching the world go by. Families played on the playground, couples strolled hand in hand, and for a moment, I let myself forget about Rick, about everything that had happened. But the peace was short-lived. My phone buzzed again. It was Rick this time. "Where'd you go? Thought we could hang out." The sight of his name on my screen sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through me. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off my phone and shoved it into my pocket, determined to stay out until my mom got home. When I finally returned to the house, it was just after 7. My mom's car wasn't in the driveway yet, but Rick's was. I hesitated at the door, my hand on the knob. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the weight of my fear pressing down on me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The house was dark, save for the soft glow of the living room lamp. I made a beeline for the stairs, hoping to avoid any interaction. "Hey!" Rick's voice stopped me cold. He was sitting on the couch, his phone in hand. "You've been out for a while." He was right. I needed some air, I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I was starting to worry about you." "I'm fine," I said quickly, moving toward the stairs. "I'm just going to my room." But Rick stepped in front of me, blocking my path. His expression was unreadable, and the tension in the air was suffocating. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. "You've been acting different." "I'm fine," I repeated, my voice firmer this time. Rick's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to push the issue. But then he stepped aside, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "All right," he said, his tone light again. "I'll let you get some rest." I didn't waste any time rushing up the stairs and locking myself in my room. My hands were shaking as I sat on my bed, staring at the clock. Just one more hour, I told myself. Just one more hour until my mom gets home. And my mom's general service announcement came on. The next hour felt like a lifetime. I paced my room, glancing at the clock every few minutes, willing the time to pass faster. My mom would be home soon, and I clung to that thought like a lifeline. The house was too quiet, and every little noise, Rick's footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, made my heart race. I kept my door locked, refusing to give him an opportunity to come near me again. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Relief flooded through me, and I bolted through my window to confirm it was her. The sight of my mom stepping out of her car felt like salvation. I hurried downstairs, ready to put some distance between Rick and myself. She walked in, juggling her purse and a couple of bags. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, her voice tired but warm. "How was the weekend?" "It was fine," I lied, my voice coming out shaky. "How was the trip?" "Exhausting," she admitted, setting her things down on the counter. "I'm glad to be home." "Where's Rick?" "Living room," I said quickly, avoiding eye contact. She nodded and made her way toward him, and I took the opportunity to escape to my room. It wasn't long before I heard their voices drifting upstairs. My mom was laughing at something Rick said, her tone light and easy. The sound twisted something inside me, a mix of anger and sadness. How could she be so oblivious? How could he act so normal, like nothing had happened? I sat on my bed, staring at the door. I knew I had to tell her. Keeping it to myself was eating me alive, but the thought of confronting her and him filled me with dread. What if she didn't believe me? What if she blamed me? My stomach churned at the possibilities. A knock on my door jolted me out of my thoughts. My mom's voice came through. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Yeah." She opened the door, peeking inside with a tired smile. "Everything okay? You've been pretty quiet." I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Rick said you two had a nice weekend." My stomach dropped. Of course he would say that. "Yeah, it was fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He said. She frowned, studying me for a moment. "You sure? You seem off." This was my chance. I could feel the words bubbling up, ready to spill out, but when I opened my mouth, all I could manage was, I'm fine." "Really?" She sighed, her shoulders relaxing. "All right. Well, I'm here if you need to talk about anything." "Thanks," I said, the guilt clawing at me as she left the room. I felt like a coward, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Not yet. She scanned me carefully. "Honey?" she asked. The next morning, I woke up early, unable to shake the weight on my chest. My mom had already left for work, and Rick was still asleep. The house was quiet, and for once the silence felt like a reprieve. I made myself some breakfast, trying to push the events of the weekend out of my mind. But as I sat at the table, the sound of footsteps behind me made my body tense. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Rick. "Morning," he said, his voice too cheerful for my liking. "Morning," I replied, keeping my focus on my plate. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, his presence suffocating. "Your mom said you've been a little out of it lately. Everything okay?" I'm fine," I said, the words feeling like a broken record at this point. Rick sipped his coffee, watching me over the rim of his mug. You know, if there's something you want to talk about." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "There's nothing to talk about." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't push further. Instead, he smiled, that same disarming smile that made my skin crawl. "All right, but the offer still stands." I stood abruptly, grabbing my plate and heading to the sink. I couldn't sit there any longer, not with him so close. As I washed my dishes, I felt his eyes on me, and my hands trembled under the weight of his gaze. "I should get going," I said, drying my hands. "I have a lot to do today." "Of course," Rick said, leaning back in his chair. "Don't let me keep you." I hurried upstairs, closing and locking my door behind me. My breathing was ragged, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in fear, constantly on edge. Something had to give. I exhaled deeply, calmly for a moment. That evening, my mom came home later than usual. Rick was in the living room, watching TV, and I stayed in my room, trying to avoid him. But when I heard my mom call my name, I knew I couldn't hide forever. I went downstairs, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. She was in the kitchen, setting the table for dinner. "Can you help me with the plates?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Sure," I said, my voice hollow. I grabbed the plates and started setting them out, my mind racing. Rick walked in a moment later, his presence making my skin prickle. He leaned against the counter, chatting casually with my mom as if nothing was out of the ordinary. As we sat down to eat, the tension in my chest became unbearable. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't sit there pretending everything was fine while Rick acted like he hadn't crossed a line. "Mom," I said suddenly, my voice trembling, "can I talk to you, alone?" She looked at me, her brow furrowing. "Now? Can it wait until after dinner?" "No," I said, my voice firmer this time. "It can't." Rick glanced between us, his expression unreadable. My mom sighed, setting down her fork. "All right, let's go to the other room." I followed her into the living room, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. She sat on the couch, looking at me expectantly. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. I hesitated, my throat tightening, but then the words came tumbling out in a rush. "It's Rick. He's been making me uncomfortable. He says things, and he's been touching me." Her expression shifted, confusion giving way to disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I'm telling the truth," I said, tears welling in my eyes. He's crossed boundaries. I don't feel safe around him." My mom stared at me, her face pale. For a moment I thought she might believe me. But then she shook her head, her voice trembling with anger. "Do you know what you're saying? Rick has been nothing but kind to you. Why would you make something like this up?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice breaking. "Why would I lie about this?" She stood, pacing the room, her hands running through her hair. You've been acting strange for weeks, and now this? Do you have any idea what you're accusing him of? I felt the tears spill over, my chest heaving with sobs. I'm not lying, Mom. Please, you have to believe me. But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She didn't believe me. And in that moment, the weight of it all came crashing down. I felt more alone than ever. The hours after Rick left felt like the house had been drained of its energy, leaving only an empty, suffocating silence in its place. I sat in my room, my thoughts churning, my emotions swinging wildly between relief, anger, and sadness. My mother's hesitant decision to ask Rick to leave gave me a flicker of hope, but her reluctance to believe me or fully confront the situation left a heavy weight on my chest. The next steps were uncertain, and I knew the fight wasn't over. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the confrontation over and over, twisting every detail until it became unbearable. I couldn't shake the memory of Rick's smug smile as he lied so effortlessly, or the look of confusion and exhaustion on my mother's face. I hated how powerless I felt, like a child screaming into a void where no one was listening. Something had to change. I couldn't live like this anymore. In the morning, I made a decision. As I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my tired eyes and pale face, I resolved to reclaim control of my life. The first step would be getting my mother to truly listen. No more half-truths or skirting around the issue. I needed to lay everything out and force her to confront the reality of what had happened. When I walked downstairs, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her coffee mug. She looked up when she heard me, her face a mixture of guilt and weariness. "Morning," she said softly. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." I sat across from her, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "I need you to hear me out," I began. "All of it, without interrupting." She nodded again, her expression guarded. "Okay."
What?
I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Reek has been crossing boundaries with me for weeks. It started with little things, compliments that felt off, or the way he'd touch my shoulder and let his hand linger. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then he started coming into my room, sitting too close, saying things that made me uncomfortable. And this weekend... My voice faltered, but I forced myself to continue. This weekend, it got worse. He's manipulative, Mom. He's been grooming me. Her eyes widened, a mix of shock and disbelief flickering across her face. Grooming you? That's a serious accusation. I know it is, I said firmly, and I wouldn't be saying it if it wasn't true. I need you to believe me, Mom. I need you to see him for who he really is. She leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling as she rubbed her temples. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. I had no idea. Because he's good at hiding it," I said. "He knows how to play the perfect boyfriend in front of you, but when you're not around, he's a completely different person." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment I thought she might finally believe me. But then she shook her head, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I was scared," I admitted. "Scared you wouldn't believe me. And honestly, I wasn't sure you would." Her face crumpled at my words, and she covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered. I thought he cared about us." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She needed to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. He doesn't care about us, Mom. He cares about control. And if you let him come back, he'll keep hurting me. I can't stay here if he does. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. You're not leaving. Then you have to choose, I said, my voice steady but filled with resolve. It's him or me. The days that followed were tense and uncertain. My mother avoided the subject of Rick entirely, throwing herself into work and coming home late every night. I could tell she was struggling, caught between denial and the harsh reality of what I'd told her. But I didn't push her. I gave her space, hoping she'd come to the right decision on her own. One evening, as I was sitting in my room scrolling through my phone, I heard her knock on the door. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, setting my phone aside. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she'd been crying. She sat on the edge of my bed, wringing her hands nervously. "I called Rick," she said after a moment. "I told him not to come back." Relief flooded through me, but I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to push her further. "What did he say?" "He denied everything," she said, her voice shaking. "Said you were making it up, that you misunderstood. But I heard something in his voice, something I can't explain. And I couldn't ignore it anymore." I nodded slowly, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions. "Thank you," I said softly. She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on mine. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for not believing you right away, for not seeing it sooner." "It's okay," I said, though the words felt hollow. I need us to move forward. I need to feel safe again." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You will," she promised. "I'll make sure of it." In the weeks that followed, things began to settle. Rick was gone, and my mom and I started to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, lingering resentment, and unspoken pain. But we were trying. She even suggested therapy, both for me and for us as a family, and I agreed. It felt like a step in the right direction. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she turned to me, her expression serious. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you," she said, "for standing up for yourself, for telling me the truth, even when it was hard." I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodding. "Huh, I'm just glad you listened." She smiled, a flicker of warmth returning to her eyes. "I'll always listen from now on, I promise." It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still scars, still moments where the memories crept in and threatened to pull me under. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. And that was enough to keep moving forward. Safe and secure for the first time, I couldn't wait to climb out of bed. The house felt different without Rick's presence, lighter and less oppressive. I found myself laughing more, spending time with my mom in a way that felt genuine and unburdened. Slowly, I began to reclaim the parts of myself I'd lost in the chaos. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others, but I was learning to heal. And in the end, that was all I could ask for. A chance to move on, to grow, and to rebuild the trust that had been broken, one step at a time. The turning point came late one night, a week after Rick had left. My mother had been distant and quiet, avoiding eye contact and throwing herself into work. I had been equally withdrawn, unable to shake the weight of her initial disbelief. But that night, everything shifted. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the faint sound of muffled crying. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the house's stillness playing tricks on my mind. But as I strained to listen, the sound grew louder, unmistakable. It was my mom. I got up and crept down the hallway, my bare feet barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. Her bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I peeked inside to see her sitting on the edge of her bed, her face buried in her hands. The sight of her like that, so broken, so unlike the strong woman I had always known, made my chest tighten. "Mom," I said softly, stepping into the room. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I failed you." Her words stopped me in my tracks. "What are you talking about?" She shook her head, her shoulders trembling. "I should have believed you from the start. I should have protected you. But I was so blinded by him, by what I thought we had." I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but now that it was here, I didn't know how to respond. "You didn't fail me," I said eventually, my voice barely above a whisper. You trusted the wrong person." She let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her eyes. "That's no excuse. You're my daughter. I'm supposed to put you first no matter what. But instead, I let him into our lives, and I didn't see what he was doing to you." The raw honesty in her voice made my throat tighten. For the first time, I saw the full weight of her guilt and regret, and it hit me just how much this was tearing her apart. "You didn't know," I said. "And when I told you, you made the right choice. That's what matters." She turned to me, her eyes filled with anguish. "But I should have known. I should have seen it. How could I let this happen?" I hesitated, my hands twisting in my lap. "I didn't want you to see it," I admitted. "I was scared. I didn't want to ruin things for you. You seemed so happy with him." Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I would have chosen you over him in a heartbeat. I should have shown you that." "You did," I said softly. "When you told him to leave, you showed me." We sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything we'd been through settling between us. It was heavy, but it didn't feel suffocating anymore. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same side. "I called a therapist," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "For both of us. I think we need it." I nodded, the tightness in my chest loosening slightly. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm but gentle. "I want us to get through this," she said. "Together. No more secrets. No more pretending everything's okay when it's not." "Me too," I said, my voice steady. "I just want to feel normal again." She smiled through her tears, a flicker of warmth returning to her expression. "We'll get there," she said. "It's going to take time, but we'll get there." The days that followed felt different. My mom and I started talking more, real conversations, not the surface-level exchanges we'd fallen into before. She asked me to tell her everything about Rick, every detail I could remember, even though it was painful for both of us. I could see the guilt in her eyes as I spoke, but she didn't interrupt or try to defend him. She just listened. The therapy sessions were hard at first, talking about what had happened, reliving the moments I wanted so desperately to forget, felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. But as the weeks went on, I started to feel a shift. The weight on my chest didn't feel as crushing, and the constant knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. My mom was making changes too. She stopped shutting me out, started being more present. She even apologized for the times she'd been too focused on her own life to notice what I was going through. It wasn't a perfect fix, nothing ever is, but it felt like we were finally moving forward. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, she turned to me suddenly. "I talked to the landlord," she said. "I'm ending Rick's lease here. He's not coming back." My face froze in frustration, as if suddenly realizing that it wasn't Rick's intention to move out. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but also a pang of fear. "What if he tries to come back anyway?" I asked. "He won't," she said firmly. "I've made it clear he's not welcome here, and if he tries anything, I'll make sure the police handle it." Her confidence gave me some comfort, though the thought of seeing Rick again still made my stomach turn. "Thank you," I said softly. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "I should have done it sooner." The turning point didn't fix everything. There were still moments of tension, still nights when I couldn't shake the memories of what had happened. But it felt like we were finally on the right path. My mom and I were learning to trust each other again, to be honest and open in a way we hadn't been before. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. We were in this together, and that made all the difference. Sitting alone in my room, I often find myself replaying everything that happened, the moments I brushed off as insignificant, the nagging feelings I ignored, and the times I hesitated to speak up. They haunt me like shadows in the corners of my mind. I wonder if I should have acted differently, spoken sooner, or been stronger. But as the days pass, I realize that dwelling on the what-ifs won't change what happened. What matters now is how I move forward. Looking back, I see how isolated I had felt, not just during Rick's presence in our lives, but for much longer. My mom and I had always had a strained relationship, something I blamed on typical teenage rebellion or her busy schedule. But now I understand it was more than that. It was the silence between us, the unspoken fears and emotions we both carried but never shared. Rick exploited that silence, slipping into the cracks of our relationship like a poison. And I let him. Not because I was weak, but because I didn't know how to speak up. I've spent so much time questioning myself. Was it my fault? Did I misinterpret his actions? Did I somehow encourage him? These thoughts have become a constant loop in my head, eroding my confidence and making me doubt my own reality. But in therapy, I've learned to challenge those thoughts. I've learned that his actions weren't about me. They were about him, his choices, his manipulations, his behavior. That was all on him. My only mistake was thinking I had to endure it alone. What an interesting... The hardest part has been coming to terms with my mother's initial reaction. When I told her the truth, I hoped for immediate validation and protection, but instead I was met with hesitation and disbelief. That moment shattered something in me, something I'm still trying to piece back together. She's apologized since then, and I know she's trying, but the wound is still raw. Trusting her again feels like stepping out onto thin ice. I want to believe it's strong enough to hold me, but the fear of falling lingers. Through all of this, I've discovered a strength in myself I didn't know existed. Speaking up, even when I was terrified no one would believe me, was the hardest thing I've ever done. It felt like throwing myself into the fire, knowing I might get burned. But I survived, and in surviving, I've learned that my voice matters. Even when it shakes, even when it's met with doubt, it matters. I've also learned the importance of boundaries. Rick blurred the lines between concern and control, kindness and manipulation, until I couldn't see them clearly anymore. Now I'm determined never to let that happen again. I've started setting boundaries with everyone in my life, including my mom. It's not easy. She struggles to let go of her guilt and sometimes overcompensates by hovering too much, but I remind her that I need space to heal in my own way. Healing has been anything but linear. Some days I feel almost normal, like I can finally breathe again. Other days the memories sneak up on me, gripping my chest and filling me with a mix of fear and anger. Therapy has helped, giving me tools to cope and a safe space to process everything. But there are still moments when I feel stuck, like I'm trapped in the past, unable to move forward. Despite the pain, I've found moments of clarity and growth. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that small voice inside me that tells me when something isn't right. I've learned that vulnerability doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. And I've learned that healing doesn't mean erasing the pain. It means learning to live with it, to carry it in a way that doesn't weigh me down. I've also started to think about what kind of person I want to be moving forward. Rick's actions and my mom's initial response taught me the importance of empathy and support. I never want anyone to feel the way I did, alone, unheard, and invalidated. I want to be someone people can turn to, someone who listens without judgment and offers unwavering support. I want to take my experience and turn it into something meaningful, something that helps others find their own strength. My relationship with my mom is still a work in progress. There are days when we laugh together, moments when it feels like we've turned a corner, but there are also moments when the weight of what happened hangs between us, unspoken but heavy. I know she's trying, and I know she loves me, but rebuilding trust takes time. I've started to see her not just as my mom, but as a flawed human being who's doing her best. That perspective doesn't erase the pain, but it helps me find compassion for her and for myself. As I reflect on everything, I realize that this experience has changed me in ways I'm still discovering. It's made me stronger, yes, but also more cautious. I'm learning to protect myself, to speak up for what I need, and to recognize the red flags I once ignored. It's a process, and I'm far from perfect, but I'm growing. I still have moments of doubt, moments when the darkness creeps in and whispers that I'll never fully heal. But then I think about how far I've come, about the steps I've taken to reclaim my life and my voice. Those steps may be small, but they're mine, and they're moving me toward a future where I can feel whole again. In the quiet moments, when the house is still and the world feels far away, I remind myself of one simple truth. I am more than what happened to me. I am more than Rick's actions, more than my mother's mistakes, more than the pain that tried to define me. I am resilient. I am healing. And I am enough. The moment my mother dismissed my words, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My throat burned with the effort to hold back more tears. She stood there, pacing with agitation, her disbelief tangible. I had braced myself for the possibility she wouldn't take my side, but the reality of it hit harder than I ever could have imagined. "You even hear yourself right now?" she demanded, turning to face me. Rick has done nothing but try to be good to you. He's supported us, helped around the house, and been patient with you when I haven't been. And now you're accusing him of what? Being inappropriate. Her words stung, each one cutting deeper into the fragile resolve I'd built up. Mom, I'm not making this up, I said, my voice trembling. You weren't here. You don't know what he's like when you're gone. Her face twisted, a mix of anger and pain. You're stressed. You've been moody for weeks, and now you're lashing out at the one person who's actually tried to help you. Help me? My voice rose, raw with emotion. You think this is helping? The way he looks at me, the things he says, it's not normal, Mom. He's not who you think he is. She shook her head, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I can't believe this, she muttered. I can't believe you'd make up something so cruel. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us both turn. Rick stood there, his face carefully composed, though I caught the faintest flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear or triumph? I couldn't tell. What's going on? He asked, his voice calm, though laced with concern. I heard shouting. My mother turned to him, her face softening instantly. She's saying things, accusing you of inappropriate behavior. Rick's brows furrowed as he took a step closer, his expression shifting into one of hurt disbelief. What? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. What did I do? You know what you did, I snapped, my voice sharp with frustration. Don't act like you don't. Rick shook his head, looking genuinely pained. I don't know what's going on here, but I would never do anything to make you uncomfortable. I care about you and your mom more than anything. If I've done something to upset you, please tell me. I'd never intentionally hurt you. The sincerity in his tone made me feel sick. He was so convincing, so practiced that for a moment I doubted myself. But then I remembered the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way his gaze had felt heavy and invasive. I knew the truth, even if no one else did. Mom, I said, turning back to her. Please, you have to believe me. She glanced between us, her face pale and strained. I don't know what to believe, she admitted, her voice trembling. But this is too much. I need time to think. You need time to think, my voice cracked. He's in our house, Mom. How can you even— Enough, she snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. I can't deal with this right now. Both of you, just go to your rooms. I need to be alone. I stared at her, my chest tight with disbelief. You're sending me away? After everything I just told you? Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I don't know what to do, all right. Just go. Rick nodded solemnly, stepping back. I'll give you space, he said softly, his gaze lingering on her before turning to me. I hope we can work through this. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The room felt suffocating, and all I wanted was to escape. I ran upstairs, slamming my door shut and locking it. My hands trembled as I leaned against the door, the weight of my mother's disbelief crashing down on me. The next few days were a blur. My mother barely spoke to me, her interactions with Rick warm and affectionate, as though nothing had happened. I felt invisible, trapped in a house that no longer felt like home. Every time Rick passed me in the hallway, he'd give me a small, almost pitying smile, as if to remind me that he'd won. I avoided him as much as possible, retreating to my room and only coming out when I was certain he wasn't around. But the tension was unbearable. I couldn't stay silent anymore, not when it felt like I was slowly unraveling. One night, when I knew my mom would be home late from work, I decided to confront Rick. My hands shook as I walked downstairs, finding him in the living room, watching TV. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his tone casual. "What's up?" "Stop calling me that," I said, my voice firm despite the knot of fear in my stomach. "We need to talk." He sighed, muting the TV. "All right, what do you want to talk about?" "Moment." I stood there, my fists clenched at my sides. "You know what you did, and I'm not gonna let you get away with it." Rick leaned back, his posture relaxed, though his eyes were sharp. "I don't know what you think I did, but I haven't done anything wrong. You're confused." "I'm not confused," I shot back. "You crossed a line, and you're manipulating her, making her think I'm the one in the wrong." He stood then, his height towering over me. "I haven't manipulated anyone," he said, his voice low and measured. "I've been nothing but kind to you, and this is how you repay me? By trying to ruin my relationship with your mom? You don't care about her," I said, my voice trembling. "You're just using her to get to me." Rick's eyes darkened, and for the first time, the mask slipped. My heart pounded, but I refused to back down. "I'm not scared of you." His lips curled into a cold smile. "You should be." The sound of the front door opening made us both turn. My mom walked in, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "What's going on?" she demanded. "Come in." "Ask him," I said, my voice breaking. "Ask him what he just said to me." Rick's expression softened instantly, his voice turning pleading. "She's upset, Jane. She's been lashing out at me all week, and I don't know why. I was just trying to talk to her, but she's twisting everything." I stared at him, stunned by how easily he lied. "That's not true. He threatened me." My mom's face was a mask of uncertainty, her gaze shifting between us. "I can't do this," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I can't handle this right now." "You can't handle it?" I shouted, my frustration boiling over. "He's lying to you, Mom. Open your eyes." "Enough," she yelled, her voice echoing through the house. "I don't know who to believe, all right? I need time." "Believe me," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm your daughter." Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. "I can't deal with this tonight." "Rick, maybe it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while." His expression tightened, but he nodded. "If that's what you want," he said softly, "I'll give you space. I'll see you, and the poster I made of you, and the poster I made of me, and no one there. You can leave." He grabbed his keys and left without another word, leaving the house in silence. My mom sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Why didn't you believe me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her eyes red. "I don't know," she admitted. I don't know." In the weeks that followed, Rick didn't return. My mom was distant, her guilt palpable but unspoken. We never talked about what happened, but the tension between us lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of the trust that had been broken. My parents' cell phones started blowing up. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel safe, but I felt like I could finally start to breathe again. And for now, that was enough.